Alright, welcome back to learning about bass lines. So if you haven't watched the first video about what you should practice first when you're first trying to walk bass lines, you should definitely watch that. And then once you've mastered those steps of being able to just play whole notes, or just the roots of each chord, and again, I'm using the form of F blues to serve as our vehicle for learning how to walk bass lines here. So once you're able to walk, or just play rather, whole notes, or the whole form, and then once you start to get more comfortable with half notes, and again, just to reiterate from the last video, working with primarily ones and fives first, and then dealing with thirds, then you can move on to what I'm going to talk about now in this video. So one particular, I'll refer to it as a sonority in bass playing, is the approaching or targeting, you can think of chord tones by either a half step below or above. So what do I mean by that? In the blues, or in F blues, if I'm going from F7 as the first chord change to B flat 7, this concept of approaching our target note from either a half step or whole step below creates a very powerful chromatic inflection, if you will. So what I mean by that is, if I'm just going to keep practicing with half notes, I could do one of two things. I could approach my target note of the second chord change, being B flat 7, from a note below, and that could sound like this. 1, 2, 3, 4. Just like that. Or I could approach it from a half step above, so that would look and sound like this. 1, 2, 3, 4. Right? That kind of thing. Or I could even, instead of going up towards it, meaning just the general root ascending like this, I could also do it like this. That's still approaching from a note below, but where I started with my first note, my F was up here instead of down here. And if I approach from a half step above, starting at this F, as opposed to this one, it would look and sound like this. 1, 2, 3, 4. Right? So with this concept, it, in my opinion, leads into another concept in bass playing, which is how often or how not often do we play the roots? Well, if we start to utilize this concept more of approaching from a half step below and above and that kind of thing, it lends itself well to resolving on chord tones that aren't necessarily the root all the time. And in a nutshell, what I mean by that is, let's say I take that bass line and I go here instead. So that would be outlining the first three chord changes of the blues. That's F7 into B flat 7, back into F7. Now, why is that possible that I can, as the bass player, it's primarily their job to play mostly roots, right? I can still successfully outline F7 by ending here. Well, that's what naturally happened because I approached this chord tone, and when I say a chord tone, I mean the 1, 3, 5, and 7 of a chord. So in this case, the C would be the fifth factor of F7, but I utilized this approaching a chord tone from a half step below. Right? There's my B flat 7. And I'm trying to get here, so I used a half step below. So really, this concept of a half step above and below doesn't just apply to targeting the roots of chords, it also applies to targeting all of the chord tones. So I'll say that one more time. This concept of approaching from a half step above or below doesn't just apply to targeting the roots of chords. It applies to targeting all of the chord tones. So that's something very important, and it helps really free you up when you're trying to walk bass lines here. So the next step would be still just walking half notes, but take at least a couple choruses to just walk half notes where you target everything, whether it's the root of the chord in the form at a point in the blues, or a chord tone that's built within the chord that you're walking over. So if I were to do a chorus strictly just approaching from a half step either above and below, that would look and sound something like this. A 1, 2, 3, 4. So as you can see, even though we're still just walking half notes and not doing full 4 quarter notes, our outlining of the harmony is really starting to take shape here, even by just talking about a few simple concepts. So now, after you're feeling pretty comfortable with that step, what you can do is you can take that concept of approaching a note above or below, whether it's the root of a chord or one of the chord tones, the 1, 3, 5, or 7, at least to start out with, and combining it with the other tools that I talked about in the last video, namely using ones and fives and thirds. So let's see what happens there when I try to combine all these elements together. And I'll just still do half notes. A 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 4. So in that particular example, I made use of approaching not just, again, the roots of chords from a half step above and below, but a couple of times in there I approached notes from a half step above and below that weren't just the roots of chords. If you're listening carefully, you would have noticed that. And again, from the last video, I utilized some fifths in there, and I utilized some thirds. So we're just adding more and more and more levels. So we broke everything down to its most basic elements, and after we master them, we're just trying to combine them. So I think we're going to end it there. Keep working on that, and just the main goal is to get comfortable with just walking half notes, and whether it's through trial and error or whatever way you want to look at it, just being very, very comfortable with just doing half note bass lines. So stay tuned for the next video, and we'll talk about this more. Thanks.